I did not come to Sleepy Hollow looking for a story. I came because certain places refuse to stay quiet once you know how to listen. The valley announces itself slowly. The road narrows without warning, trees closing in as if they were planted to discourage forward motion. Even in daylight, the air feels held, cooler, heavier, like a breath not yet released. I noticed it before I knew where I was. The way sound dulled, the way my footsteps seemed to arrive a second late. Locals call this place Sleepy Hollow, but that name came later. Long before it was written down, the valley already had a reputation, not for danger, but for containment. Things entered here and did not move on easily. Fog lingered longer. Echoes behaved strangely, and people, once settled, stayed generation after generation. I parked near the old Dutch church just before dusk. The burial ground sits slightly elevated, stones tilted and eroded, names worn thin by centuries of weather and neglect. No grand markers, no heroic language, just dates, initials, and gaps where time erased whatever certainty once existed. This is where the horseman is said to begin, but that is now how the locals describe it. They do not say he appears, they say the valley remembers him. During the Revolutionary War, this region was unstable ground. British forces, colonial militias, Haitian mercenaries, all passed through. Skirmishes happened without record. Men died without witnesses. Burial was practical, not ceremonial. In several church ledgers from the late 1700s, I found entries that stopped mid-sentence. Names written, then crossed out. Causes of death replaced with blanks. One entry dated during a winter campaign simply reads, "Foreign soldier, head lost." At first glance, this seems unremarkable. Artillery accidents were common. No name, no regiment, no further explanation. But what followed that burial is what interests me, because the accounts do not begin with fear. They begin with routine disruption. Horses refusing a familiar road, dogs stopping short of the churchyard fence, riders returning shaken, unable to explain why they had turned back. I spoke to a caretaker whose family has lived here since before the Civil War. He did not mention the horseman until I asked about night travel. Even then, he did not smile. "You don't test the old road after dark," he said, "not because something will chase you, but something might follow. That distinction matters." Folklore often exaggerates pursuit. This one does not. The earliest descriptions do not mention speed or violence. They mention presence. The sensation of being accompanied by something that does not breathe, does not tire, and does not need light to see. As night settled, fog rose from the low ground, collecting between the trees exactly where the road bends towards the bridge. I stood there longer than I intended to, listening. No hooves, no figures, just the uncomfortable awareness that this place had been waiting long before I arrived. And that whatever rode these roads centuries ago may never have learned the war ended. Because some dead are not restless, they're still on duty. I began the second day where most investigations like this end, in paperwork. The town archives sit just beyond the valley, a modern building meant to feel neutral, fluorescent lights, climate control, order. But even here, Sleepy Hollow intrudes in small ways. Boxes mislabeled, folders returned to the wrong shelves, margins filled with notes written decades apart by different hands, all circling the same absences. I was not looking for Irving. I was looking for before Irving. The Revolutionary War records are thin by design. Militias did not keep consistent logs. Haitian mercenaries were often buried without ceremony, especially if they died far from their assigned units. But what drew my attention were not the missing names, it was the repetition of the same phrases across unrelated documents. Unfit for night patrol, horses unsettled, road avoidance advised. These were not folklore terms, they were logistical ones. One ledger dated 1779 recorded a complaint from a supply officer about men refusing to escort wagons past the old church after sunset. Another noted a sentry abandoning his post after hearing mounted movement with no visible source. No mention of ghosts, no accusations of cowardice, just quiet reassignment. War does not indulge superstition unless something interferes with function. I requested access to the church records next. The caretaker hesitated, not because access was restricted, but because no one ever asks for them anymore. The pages smelled faintly of damp paper and iron. Ink held bled through generations of handling. That is where I found it again. The same burial entry, the same incomplete description, but this time a margin note had been added years later in a different hand. Grave disturbed, no evidence, head not found. That line unsettled me more than any legend because it implied a search, a deliberate attempt to correct something long after the burial itself. Someone had believed the absence mattered. Local oral accounts suggest the searches began after riders started reporting matching movement behind them, hooves that adjusted when they adjusted, that slowed when they slowed. One witness described it as being escorted by something that knew the road better than I did. No aggression, no warning, just accompaniment. The first explicit description of the figure appears in a private letter, never meant for publication. A farmer writing to his brother described seeing a mounted soldier near the bend in the road, posture rigid, uniform indistinct, carrying a round vade under his arm, pale as a moonlit stone. The rider did not flee, he turned around, and the figure turned with him, perfectly, maintaining distance, as if bound to formation. That detail appears again and again in later accounts. The horseman does not close the gap, he maintains it, like a patrol boundary, like a regulation distance drilled into muscle memory. As I read, a pattern emerged that I could not ignore. The sightings increased after reenactments, after military parades, after uniforms returned to the valley. History, when worn visibly, seemed to activate something that never fully deactivated. By the end of the day, I realized the story of the horseman was not centered on violence or revenge. It was centered on procedure, on unfinished orders, on a soldier whose death removed command but not obligation. That night, I walked the road myself. No costume, no camera, no lights. Just to see what it felt like to move through a place where the past still appeared to be following instructions. I did not hear hooves, but I did slow down, instinctively, near the bend. And when I stopped, the valley felt like it stopped with me. The bridge is older than most visitors realize. Its timbers are reinforced, patched, and replaced over centuries, but the location itself has never moved. Locals call it the old boundary, though few remember why. For the settlers and the soldiers before them, the bridge was not just a crossing over the creek. It was a line between the living road and the resting place of those who had died too violently, too abruptly, or too young to rest. I approached it just after dusk, the fog rolling thicker than I expected. The valley swallowed the sound of my boots, muted it, pushed it back as if testing whether I belonged. A chill rose from the water, sharp and dry against my skin. I felt it in my bones. This was where the horseman's patrol ended, or at least where most people believed it ended. I kept moving, step by step. I noticed the rhythm of the fog. It wasn't random. There was cadence here, measured, deliberate. My pulse matched it almost unconsciously. I tried to shake the sensation. Nothing worked. Writers from decades ago described the same feeling. Hooves that pace perfectly alongside, visible yet consistent. The horseman does not gallop, he does not charge, he matches. Distance matters, space is maintained. The bridge, as if a rule engraved into the valley itself, halts the pursuit. Some accounts say it stops the horseman completely. Others insist he tilts his headless form over the railing, watching those who dare to cross before vanishing back into the fog beyond. I paused mid-span. The creek below moved slow, dark, reflective. I imagined a soldier buried downstream centuries ago, headless, waiting for patrol orders that had no end. It seemed ridiculous, and yet, reading the contemporary letters, the private notes, the first-hand diaries, I understood why these lines were never crossed. The horseman was not malevolent. He was procedural, bound, limited only by the geography and memory embedded in the valley. The wind shifted, a faint clatter from the woods behind me, too subtle to call hooves, yet enough to make my hair rise. I did not turn. I did not want to. I had read enough to know that looking was a test, one no living person had ever passed unscathed. The valley had rules, rules older than me, rules older than the bridge, rules older than Washington Irving, who would later shape the story for the world. The horseman is not a character in a tale. He is a function of the land, the war, an unfinished duty, and while the bridge holds him at bay, it does not erase him. I stepped across, and the fog followed. I felt it in my chest, a presence that neither attacked nor fled. Just a reminder, a boundary enforced without malice, without haste, without sound. That night, the valley seemed to breathe around me, slow, measured, patient, waiting for the next person who would walk its road without knowing what they were walking into. The next morning I returned to the valley before sunrise. Mist hung low over the road, thicker than any fog I had encountered before. It swallowed the trees halfway up their trunks and turned familiar bends into illusions. I walked slowly, deliberately, notebook in hand. Every footstep sounded louder than expected, though the fog dampened everything beyond a few meters. Locals had warned me to avoid looking for the horseman directly, but I wanted to see what they had felt, to measure it, to understand. It began with the eyes, not literal eyes, but the way the fog seemed to track me. Shapes would flare in the corner of my vision, just beyond recognition. Shadows bent around trunks as if alive. The sensation was subtle at first, just enough to make me adjust my pace, glance over my shoulder, tense my shoulders. Then it became impossible to ignore. The fog was aware of me, and not in the way weather is aware, in the way a being measures distance and intention. I stopped at a familiar bend, the curve that leads toward the old burial ground. The road was empty. The creek murmured quietly to my right, and then I heard it, a faint, irregular clop. Not fast, not galloping, just a hoof striking something solid, measured. My first instinct was to assume a deer, but the sound matched my pace almost perfectly, mirroring me as I moved forward. I held my breath. I could feel it then, the valley itself holding the rhythm, the fog shaping itself into a presence, and in that moment, I understood why previous accounts insisted the horseman did not chase. He did not need to. The effect was enough. Awareness alone was enough. He was a shadow that confirmed history, a presence that validated absence, a figure imposed on reality by the memory of war. I dared one glance over my shoulder. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the outline of a horse, tall, rigid, unnatural in posture, with the rider leaning forward, arm cradling an invisible weight. Then the mist swallowed it, leaving nothing but the lingering sense of merriment. I walked on, heart racing, lungs tight. This was not fear in the conventional sense. Fear implies threat. What I felt was acknowledgement, a recognition that I was a newcomer, stepping into routines older than the valley itself. By the time the sun began to rise, the clopping had stopped. The fog lifted in patches, revealing the road, the creek, the leaning gravestones. But I knew it was still there, waiting, watching, following the rules the living could not see. And that's when I realized the horseman is not bound to bodies or names. He's bound to movement, protocol, and memory. He does not act with intent. He acts with fidelity. The valley had trained him, and I had entered his territory. By midday, I shifted my investigation from the road to the people who had walked it before me. I met with a local historian whose family had lived near Sleepy Hollow for 5 generations. He insisted on anonymity, as if the story carried weight beyond folklore. Over tea in a small, wood-paneled room, he handed me journals, letters, and diaries, all detailing encounters with the headless rider spanning nearly a century. The accounts were remarkably consistent, not in appearance, but in behavior. One farmer wrote of returning from a late errand with his horse when he noticed the sound of hooves behind him. He described turning once and seeing a mounted figure matching his pace exactly. No words were exchanged, no attempt at harm. He wrote that the figure tilted its head slightly toward me, as though inspecting his intentions. Another account decades later came from a militia reenactor walking the same stretch of road. He heard the horse behind him and felt a weight in the atmosphere, a presence that pressed against him in silence. He dared not to look, fearing the consequence of the acknowledgement. By the time he reached the bridge, the sound faded. These stories shared an underlying theme. The horseman enforces boundaries, not fear. Children on the valley also passed down warnings. One elderly woman recounted her grandfather instructing her never to linger near the creek at night, never to provoke the horseman. She remembered his words clearly. He is not angry. He is precise. He rides the orders left unfinished. What struck me most was the uniformity of reaction. Riders never attempted confrontation. They never ran indiscriminately. They followed the instinct to maintain distance and cross the bridge without pause. The horseman seemed to demand respect, but not in the form of fear or ritual, in the form of acknowledgement. I decided to experience this firsthand. Late in the afternoon, I mounted a borrowed horse, choosing the bend where most reports occurred. The valley was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I moved at a measured pace, feeling the tension in the reins, listening to each hoofbeat, each faintly off the low fog. And then I heard it. Behind me, a soft, rhythmic clop that matched every stride. My pulse quickened, but I held steady. I did not dare glance back. The sound followed me for nearly half a mile, never accelerating, never fading, just persistent. And then as if I had crossed an invisible line. It stopped. No figure appeared, no confrontation, just silence. The horseman had verified compliance. That night, back at my lodging, I reviewed the journals again. A realization settled in. The horseman is not a story for entertainment. He is a measure of how we interact with history. A soldier whose duty was never completed, now acting through the land, through time, ensuring that those who traverse the valley understand the rules imposed centuries ago. The weight of it lingered, not as fear, but as responsibility. To understand the horseman, I needed to step back nearly 2 centuries, to the time when Sleepy Hollow was a crossroads of war and settlement. The valley was far from neutral. It had been occupied by British troops, Haitian mercenaries, and local militias. Skirmishes were frequent, often unrecorded. Bodies were buried hastily, far from any ceremony. One entry in a militia ledger caught my attention, a report of a Haitian soldier separated from his unit during a night engagement. The entry is sparse, factual, detached. Engagement near creek, death confirmed, head missing, burial in churchyard. The note is brief, almost dismissive, but the context reveals a deeper pattern. These were men who died on the edge of the battlefield, without witnesses, without rights. Their deaths were accounted for only in terms of function. The soldier is missing, the task incomplete, the road unpatrolled. This is where the legend becomes logical. The horseman, as described in later accounts, behaves like a soldier following orders he never completed in life. He patrols a specific route. He maintains distance. He enforces boundaries. He does not attack. He does not deviate. He is a continuation of military duty, not malice or vengeance. I traced the roads near the churchyard. They are not arbitrary. The bends, the bridge, the open fields, each corresponds to historic patrol paths recorded in fragmented militia and Haitian documents. The horseman's patrol aligns almost perfectly with these old routes. Even the bridge, often mentioned as a stopping point, is precisely where the original path would have required soldiers to pause, check lines, and maintain formation. Interviews with descendants of the settlers provided further insight. One elderly man described a story passed down from his grandfather, a Haitian soldier who lost his head to the cannonball, but not his duty. The man's words were casual, almost matter of fact, but they carried the weight of lived belief. In Sleepy Hollow, the horseman is not a ghost in the conventional sense. He is memory made flesh, an echo of order where death left only confusion. That evening I walked the path along the creek again, following the patrol route as best as I could reconstruct it. The air hung thick with fog, the faint rustle of leaves reminding me that this valley does not belong to the living alone. I felt the presence again, not looming, not threatening, just measured, as if the valley itself had set a timer long before I arrived. The more I learned, the more it became clear. The horseman is not bound to revenge or violence. He is bound to the unfinished work of the past, patrolling a valley that refuses to let memory fade. I spent the next morning poring over diaries collected from families who had lived in the valley for generations. Some were simple farm journals, others belonged to itinerant riders, travelers, or militia descendants. What struck me was the consistency of detail, even across decades. One entry, written in 1823, belonged to a young farmer named Peter Van Tassel. He described a routine errand to the mill along the bend near the creek. The road seemed quieter than usual. My horse shied at nothing, yet I could hear hooves behind me. I dared not to look, for I felt that seeing would demand something I could not give. When I reached the bridge, the sound stopped abruptly, and I breathed for the first time in a mile. Another from 1841 told of a teacher escorting students home at dusk. She wrote, "The sound of hooves followed us at the exact pace of our horses." One of the children screamed when a shadow moved in the fog. Though we saw nothing, by the bridge it ceased. I still feel it behind me, even years later. I read these passages aloud to myself in the quiet archive. The act of voicing them made the valley seem present in the room. There was no exaggeration, no literary flourish, just repeated observation. A figure that follows, measures, and disappears at the bridge. The most striking diary belonged to a man who claimed to have tested the boundary deliberately. He wore his father's Hessian coat, carrying the exact saber his ancestor had used during the war. He mounted his horse at dusk and rode the familiar curve toward the creek. The hoofs came almost instantly. I matched my pace with them, not daring to speed ahead. The figure appeared, its form dark, posture rigid, carrying a pale object where its head should have been. I did not falter. I did not turn. When I reached the bridge, the presence lifted as if released by a command I could not see. I cannot explain, but I know it is real. These accounts were remarkable not for horror, but for discipline. Unlike other legends, this one enforced rules rather than chaos. The horseman demanded nothing emotional, no fear, no repentance, only adherence to movement and ritual. I decided to see if I could replicate Peter Van Tassel's errand, mounted again at dusk, following the bend, listening to the faint creak. I felt the valley adjust around me. The air itself seemed to recognize me as an intruder, yet measured my stride, my posture, my intent. I did not see the horseman directly. I did not need to. The valley did not allow that. It allowed only acknowledgement, which is far heavier than sight. By the time I returned to the churchyard, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving a deep amber haze in the sky. The bridge loomed ahead, and in that lingering twilight, I understood something crucial. The horseman is less a rider and more a process, a calculation of duty, geography, and memory made manifest. The valley will not forget, and neither will those who walk it. That evening I returned alone, walking instead of riding. Horses make noise, footsteps are quieter, subtler. I wanted to feel the difference, the way the valley treats those who move lightly versus those who command horsepower. The fog had returned, heavier than any I had witnessed before. Trees leaned inward, branches brushing like tentative fingers across my coat. The road curved gently toward the creek, and somewhere beyond my sight, the valley held its breath. Then I heard it, a clop behind me, not rapid, not urgent, just measured, deliberate. My pulse tightened and I froze. This is where it differs from any typical ghost story. The horseman does not rush you. He does not chase. He mirrors. Every step I took, every pause I made, the clop reflected back at the same rhythm. I forced myself to continue walking, my feet crunching against the gravel, fog curling around my legs. The sound stayed with me, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always matching my pace. I remembered the diaries, the accounts of Peter Van Tassel and the teacher escorting her students. They had described the same sensation. The horseman is present, but he does not need to be seen to be confirmed. I dared a glance over my shoulder. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a silhouette, mounted, upright, a weight where the head should be. slightly tilting as if weighing me. Then the mist swallowed it entirely. The valley does not grant sight freely, it gives experience, the kind that lingers in memory, in posture, in the sense that you're not quite alone. I walked on, reaching the bridge just as the last light bled from the sky. The hoofbeats stopped. The air, once taut with expectation, relaxed almost imperceptibly. I realized then that the horseman is not hunting. He does not pursue. He is a boundary enforcer, a mayor of behavior, of obedience to paths carved centuries ago. To cross the bridge, to respect the road, to move without breaking the unspoken rules, that is enough. And yet, the presence remains, always patient, always calculating, waiting for the next traveler who might forget the rules, who might misstep. By the time I returned to my lodgings, I was not shaken with fear. I was aware, deeply aware, that some paths carry memory in a tangible, almost physical way. Some figures patrol not out of malice, but because history refuses to end. The valley had taught me a quiet truth. What follows you is not always seen, but it is always present. That night I returned to the valley just as darkness was settling in. The sun had vanished entirely, leaving the world in shades of gray and black, the fog thickening into something almost tangible. The road ahead was barely visible, the creek hidden behind a wall of mist, and the trees stretched like silent sentinels along the path. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Every sense was heightened. The air smelled of damp leaves and cold stone, and the faint murmur of the creek was constant, like a heartbeat. And then I heard it. The clop of hooves, soft at first, almost mistaken for the rhythm of my own heartbeat, but precise, deliberate, unmistakable. I froze. This time I did not glance back. I remembered the warnings passed down through generations. Never look directly, never test the boundaries, never assume what you see is real. The horseman is not a ghost, they said. He is a procedure of the valley, a soldier bound by duty, centuries dead. I continued walking. Each step was measured, synchronized with the rhythm that followed me. I felt the valley responding, as if it were aware of every move. It was alive in a way that the daylight could never reveal. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the fog. A dark, upright form, mounted, arm cradling something pale and featureless. It did not advance, it did not speak, it mirrored me, respecting the distance the valley had decreed. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, but it was not fear I felt. It was understanding. The horseman is not hunting. He is enforcing, following orders that were never completed, patrolling a path that the living cannot fully perceive. I reached the bridge, the boundary reinforced by centuries of repetition. The hoofbeats ceased exactly there, as if a rule had been executed perfectly. The valley exhaled in silence, and for a moment, the world felt normal again, though I knew it was not. That night, as I retreated from the road, I realized the truth the villagers had known for generations. The horseman is not a tale. He is memory made motion, a living echo of war, duty, and the unbroken rules of the land, and Sleepy Hollow is his domain, patient, precise, and eternal. The following evening I returned once more, determined to push farther along the path that I had before. The fog hung like a curtain, thick and unyielding, swallowing trees and road alike. Every step forward felt like intruding into something alive, something that had been waiting for centuries. I walked slowly, paying attention to every sound, every shift in the mist, and then I heard it. The familiar clop of hooves, measured, deliberate, echoing in a way that made the air itself feel heavy. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. For a long stretch, I moved in silence, the sound following me perfectly. Then I noticed subtle cues, the way the fog seemed to bend around an invisible figure, the way shadows stretched unnaturally along the road. I realized it was not merely observing the valley, I was participating in its history. I reached the bend near the churchyard, the area almost referenced in the diaries. The stories came alive here. I could almost see the Hessian soldier patrolling, unseen yet omnipresent, bound by duty even in death. The past and present overlapped. My footsteps mirrored those of men who had walked this path over 200 years ago. Their presence folded in the landscape itself. I paused. The air felt charged. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shape, mounted, rigid, arm cradling a pale object where a head should be. Not approaching, not retreating, simply existing alongside me, enforcing the invisible rules of the valley. I did not turn to face it directly. That would have been a violation. Instead, I continued along the path, step by step, heart racing, mind absorbing every nuance. The horseman did not need to act violently. His presence alone was enough, a reminder that certain duties never end, that the land remembers what humans forget. By the time I reached the bridge, the hoofbeats had stopped. The fog began to thin just enough to reveal the creek and the leaning gravestones. I felt a strange combination of relief and reverence. The horseman had done nothing hostile, yet the experience left an imprint far heavier than any conventional encounter with fear. In that moment, I understood fully what the locals had meant. This figure is not a ghost. He is history, embodied and unbroken. He is a measure of obedience, memory, and respect, an invisible sentinel whose rules are as precise today as they were centuries ago. The valley had shown me its truth, and I knew I could never walk that road the same way again.